We have two former ambassadors with us, a former ambassador of Israel to the United States and a former ambassador of the United States to Israel. So it should make a fascinating, I think, exchange. I also want to note that both of them are now retired and in academia. Itamar Rabinovich comes from a background of Middle East studies at Tel Aviv University. He served for a term as president of Tel Aviv University. Dan Kurtzer served for a term as dean of Yeshiva College. So again, you have two different perspectives on Jewish higher education. We'll probably avoid that. And currently, Itamar Rabinovich is head of the Israel Institute in Washington and Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, which develops strategies on Israel education, and Dan Kurtzer is a professor of Middle East Studies at the Woodrow Wilson School of Princeton University. Having said that, I want to start off by throwing a question out to the two of you. Maybe start with Dan on this one. The U.S.-Israel relationship right now has been described, is frequently described, as the worst it's ever been. Do you share that view?
Yes. And thank you for coming tonight. I'm sorry I didn't come all day. I understand it was quite a good conference. So excuse me if I, in the response to this question or others, I repeat some of the things you heard. I'm quite worried about the U.S.-Israel relationship for a number of reasons. The most obvious, but the least important of those reasons, is the problems at the top. The president and the prime minister are so at odds with each other, and don't like each other and don't trust each other, that it informs almost everything else that goes on in the relationship on a day-to-day basis. But in practical terms, that's the least significant of the issues that worries me, because in fact, we have, at least the United States has a time limit by which the president will no longer be president, and presumably a fresh start can be had when a new president is elected in about 2 years. What worries me far more than the problems at the top are the divergence, or is the divergence of strategic concerns that motivate the two countries. And it's the first time that I can recall that we have a very serious list of issues on which the United States and Israel are really at odds with each other. Now, the obvious, which we're going to talk about, I assume, is Iran. We both agree that we don't want Iran to become a nuclear weapons state, but the difference in the approach of how to accomplish that purpose has really set us quite far apart. But look at the other issues that have come up recently. Israel absenting itself from a vote at the United Nations on Ukraine. Israel not supporting the United States when it, or the administration, when the opening to Cuba was announced. Israel just in the last couple of days announcing that it's going to join a bank in Asia being promoted by the Chinese government, which the United States is fighting quite strongly against for a lot of reasons that are not relevant for our purposes today. And then the larger question that we've seen in the last couple of years since the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring of Israel believing that the United States pushed Mubarak under the bus and let our traditional allies go, and therefore the United States and Israel have different perceptions. So, these things can change over time because strategic interests change, and maybe we can realign them. But if you add up the problems at the top, the differences in strategic approach, the nastiness that's crept into the discourse, calling each other names, which, even the worst of times, and Itamar and I had the occasion over the years to live through some of the times that weren't perfect. There was always at least a kind of mutual respect, and we don't have that now at all. So that's a long way of saying yes. This is the worst I've seen it, and it makes me quite nervous.
Itamar, can you answer the same question?
Yes. I can't overcome the temptation, since we have a former American ambassador to Israel and a former Israeli ambassador to Washington, to share with you one of my favorite stories. I was the ambassador in Washington. A phone rings at 3 a.m. and a young woman says, "It's the Prime Minister's office." And I said, "Half asleep, 3 a.m. in the morning, something terrible must have happened." And then I hear the voice of the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff said that, "Not the American Israeli in America, dummy, the American ambassador in Israel," I said. So, in any event.
I had the exact same story, by the way, in Israel.
Okay. Now, I share Dan's bottom line and his most of his reasoning. I'd like to add a few. The Israel absenting itself from the vote on Ukraine. This is to some extent the Prime Minister, to some extent Mr. Lieberman, who was then Foreign Minister. The whole sort of gambit on Putin has totally failed, and Israel now is actually in a state of tension with Putin because Putin discovered Israel wants to sell some weapons to Ukraine, and he's now threatening Israel. Israel is unhappy with the fact that he's selling the SA-300 to Iran, and whatever the logic of trying to be on the good side of Putin over Ukraine obviously didn't work out. Worse than that, at the time, some Israeli officials in briefings and speeches explained that the whole nature of the relationship has changed. Israel is now less dependent on the United States. There are substitutes. If Obama continues the way he does, we have other options: China, Russia, Brazil, India. You know, and I'm not inventing all of this, but if anyone in his right mind thinks that the American alliance could be replaced by any of the above, or the combination of the above, must not have a fundamental understanding of international politics. But that must have been a mood in the Israeli public, was not lost on the administration, and to some extent on American public opinion. Another issue that Dan has not mentioned, I will, is the breaking a traditional mode of the bipartisanship and identifying support for Israel or Israel orientation with one party in this country more than with another. So I mean, I've over the years there've been some bad periods. I'm presently writing a biography of Yitzhak Rabin, and I'm going over some bad moments. The Rogers Plan of December 1969, the reassessment with Kissinger and Ford in March 1975. Israel did mobilize public opinion in this country and angered the president. Israel organized letters written by 76 senators that angered President Ford, and so forth and so on. There were some bad moments. You can recall Secretary Baker on television offering Israel the phone number of the White House exchange when it became serious about peace. And there was some, the Rabin-Carter relationship, or the Begin-Carter relationships were very bad personal relationships and in moments of tension. But I think whatever Ambassador Kerzen said, and I add up to what definitely is the worst period in the relationship. I'm sorry, with one correction, not the first years. I think the early 50s, the United States did vote for the establishment of Israel, but there was an arms embargo. There was, with people like Marshall Acheson and that group, there was a sense that it may have been a mistake to recognize Israel altogether. This, until about 58, was not a good relationship, but it kept improving, and of course reached a peak after 1967. And if we look from that perspective, late 50s and on, it is the worst period.
Well, this may be a little bit touchy, but since you're both retired from government service, maybe I can ask, is it possible to point to one side or the other as having changed its approach? Or, I mean, there's a widespread perception, I think, in the Jewish community, certainly, that Obama's a different kind of president. And I'm wondering, is Obama a different kind of president? Is Netanyahu a different kind of prime minister? Or is it both of them? Or circumstances?
Yeah, go ahead. Then.
Look, to some extent, when you have these kinds of problems, and both quantity and quality, they're going to be blame attributable to both sides. I think that's very true here. Obama got off to a rocky start, even during the campaign, by having to defend himself against his pastor and his church, you remember, and his middle name, and was he really a Muslim and not a Muslim? And there were a whole bunch of issues that came up even before he was elected. And then, in a sense, it became exacerbated when he didn't show up for a trip to Israel to at least balance off the trips that he took to Istanbul and Cairo to talk about improving relations with the Arab world and the Muslim world. And there was a sense that he was consciously distancing himself from Israel, and not just a sense. In fact, reported very early on in 2009 was a discussion that he held in the White House with leaders of the American Jewish community, in which one of them said, you know, previous presidents were much warmer to the state of Israel than you. And Obama's retort was, they may have been warmer, but they didn't accomplish anything that helped you advance towards peace. The point being that Obama fancied himself as perhaps a tougher peacemaker. And of course, on the other side, we know the litany of issues that have created problems. What's interesting, and I wait to hear Itamar's response on this. Netanyahu's problem with the United States has not started with Barack Obama. He was declared persona non grata in the State Department when he was Deputy Foreign Minister in the George H.W. Bush administration, a Republican administration, for comments that he made about American policy that were really despicable. He called American policy built on lies and fabrications. And James Baker at that point said that the Deputy Foreign Minister of the State of Israel would not be permitted to return to the State Department. You then had a repeat performance with Bill Clinton. For those of you who've read, I think it's in Dennis Strauss's book, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe in Bill Clinton's book itself, where they, right after the first meeting that Clinton had with the newly elected Benjamin Netanyahu, Clinton leaves the meeting in anger and says, who's the head of the superpower here, me or him? But he used more colorful language, as you would imagine. So
It didn't involve chickens or anything like that, did it?
no, the chickens came from our side this time. So there's been a problem for quite some time between Netanyahu and the United States that I don't quite understand. And then that has now been actualized by Netanyahu's behavior. He certainly was angry at the president's call for a settlements freeze back at the beginning of the administration. But the rhetoric and the level of anger, and then allowing his cabinet members to use the language that they've used, leading up to, and I hope it's the worst that we see, but who knows, leading up to this gambit with John Boehner, in which even major supporters of Likud in this country believed that the prime minister had not only insulted the president, but the office of the president. And that's really something that's unprecedented in this relationship.
I think we need to look at this relationship against the background of the previous 16 years. With both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, for most of his period, people forget some icy, dicey periods in his relationship with Sharon, but for most of his period, certainly after 9/11 and Bill Clinton for his 8 years, were extremely friendly, cordial with Israel, had a very good personal and working relationship with Israeli prime ministers, their staffs did. After these 16 years, we definitely are in a different period. So part of the problem is that President Obama and policy are judged against that background, you could not have that kind of a relationship forever. So after 16 years, there was a change, and this is a background. Secondly, I think that both men made serious mistakes at the outset. They created distrust with each other. Obama came to the conclusion that Netanyahu wants to undermine him, play games with the Republicans, and Netanyahu came to the conclusion that Obama wants to replace him. When, for instance, if Netanyahu says, "Oh, I cannot do that. I don't have the coalition or the government for doing that," and Obama says, "Well, but there can be another coalition," by which he meant you have an option to have another coalition, which Netanyahu sees as, "Oh, he wants to have me replaced." So that relationship began badly and went from bad to worse. I think early on, my feeling was that if I were an advisor to President Obama, I would have advised him to create an explicit linkage between the two main issues on the agenda, the Iranian and the Palestinian, and to tell Netanyahu that if your main concern is the Iranian issue, I'll work with you to deal with this issue to our mutual satisfaction, provided you go along with me on the Palestinian issue. That might have put the relationship on a different footing. Secondly, I don't think that during these 6 years there was one, let's say, honest, open discussion between the two of them, the kind that the previous presidents have had. From my experience, one of the things the U.S. president wants to see, first and foremost, in an Israeli counterpart is full trust. It's better to say no than to say yes and then not to deliver. The moment there's no trust, the relationship cannot be on a sound footing, and so forth and so forth. So now on Netanyahu. I think Netanyahu, who grew up in this country and was an American citizen, and feels very comfortable, I'd say, more with Republicans. I resigned when he was elected in '96, but he asked me to stay for 3 months, so I worked with him for 3 months. When he came to speak to a joint session of Congress, another one, I could see this was the Gingrich Congress, see the young Republican congressman cheering somebody who basically they saw as one of their own. A young Republican who happened to be the Prime Minister of Israel, but could easily have been an American politician. And I think that at some level, Netanyahu operates as if he was an American politician, and he thinks that he should be playing not on a congressional court, but on the presidential court. That's the level he prefers, and presidents don't like that. I also am aware of the Clinton quote at the end of that meeting, and obviously that doesn't help. I'd also add one more thing. I think that one of Obama's weaknesses, not just in the Israeli context, is he does not communicate well with world leaders. European leaders, I know, West European leaders also complain about the difficulty of building a rapport with him. So Netanyahu, in that regard, is not the only one.
React, please, Dan, to Itamar's suggestion that there should have been a linkage between Iran and the Palestinian issue early on. Does that sound...
I think in theory it sounds like an idea that might have been explored, but coming 6 years into this very troubled relationship where trust was absent and where a deep mutual strategic understanding was absent, I frankly think it was not going to work. Netanyahu, I think, believes that he can simply outlast Obama with respect to the situation on the ground in the occupied territories vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And he has thought, at least until this recent congressional action, that he could defeat the president using his contacts on the Hill and activating a now Republican majority. So under other circumstances, there's an option here of working through a strategic trade-off, which is what Itamar was suggesting. But I think in this case it was too late and would have been foiled by the absolute mistrust on the part of the two of them.
Sorry, one correction. I meant at the very outset, not now.
Oh.
You mean
Yeah.
in 2009, at the very outset.
Oh, sure. In 2009, before
Yeah.
they learned to distrust each other,
Yeah.
then that might have been an interesting way to proceed. It also might have helped Obama avoid the problem of starting off on the peace process with the demand for a complete settlements freeze, which even if you don't like settlements, which American governments don't like settlements, American governments have come to learn that you can't ask an Israeli prime minister to do a complete freeze on settlements, including natural growth, in the absence of a process, in the absence of something that delivers a political win for a prime minister. So yeah, maybe at the beginning it might have been an interesting way to proceed. Frankly, I had an alternative idea at the beginning of the administration, which was why didn't the Obama administration pick up where things, or try to pick up where things had left off between Ehud Olmert and Mahmoud Abbas in September 2008. We now know from what Olmert has said publicly, and we have a peek into Palestinian decision-making with the leaking of the Palestine Papers, that the two of them had come about as close as the two sides had ever come in narrowing some of the differences, not all of the differences. And the Obama administration did not try even to explore the idea of picking up where things had left off. It would have been quite hard to do, maybe impossible, but having not tried, they simply allowed whatever progress had been made informally to go by the wayside, and we lost it.
Wasn't that what Netanyahu meant by no preconditions, talks without no preconditions, meaning starting again from zero?
Well, that's what he meant, but that should not necessarily bind the United States in terms of our own policy. I mean, it's fair to talk to a prime minister or a president of the Palestinian Authority, and they have different views, and it's also fair for the United States to bring its own views to the table. And had Obama said, look, we may not get progress fast, but I'm committed to trying to get you back to where we were in September of '08, and let's work on that for a while through quiet diplomacy, and you and I will meet, and we'll see what we can do and narrow differences and maybe get back 20% of the way or 40% of the way. But the administration simply walked away from that progress and never tried.
Itamar, you were saying that if Obama had offered a trade-off at the beginning, things might have started off better. Sitting where we are now and looking back, the implication of what you're suggesting is that he could have worked for a better Iran deal than we ended up with. Was there such a thing as a better Iran deal? Is this Iran deal the failure that Israel is presenting it as?
No, I am for a deal. I think there could have been a better deal, but I'm doubtful that it can be tinkered with seriously now. Possibly working with Israel, using the Israeli military threat to get a deal, that might have worked. That might have worked better. But you know, the linkage is always there, because in the nature of things, if there is a basket of issues between two countries, they're all on the table and they're all being dealt with at the same time. So willy-nilly there is some form of linkage. You can sometimes make it more explicit and try to make the best of it.
If I could just add one thing to what Itamar said. Let's remember the timeline of what we're talking about. When Obama came into office, there was no diplomatic track at all with the Iranians. And the sanctions that were in place were largely unilateral American sanctions and very, very thin veneer of international sanctions. It wasn't until the failure of the first round of diplomacy, which was undertaken in October of 2009 by the P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany. When that round failed, and the failure was attributable to Iran, the United States was able to then move in the Security Council to gain Russian and Chinese support for the sanctions, which we now know became biting over the course of those subsequent years. So in effect, to think that we might have been able to work, I think the idea of a trade-off should have been discussed, but you needed the diplomacy to bring about the sanctions to add to the coercive element, which in addition to the threat of Israeli and American military force, might have combined to persuade Iran to move faster and harder. But right at the beginning of the administration, that opportunity did not present itself. Maybe a year later, or slightly more than a year later, after the sanctions were in place, then I think there may have been an opening to try some of this coordinated diplomacy.
One more question for the two of you. What you said suggests, I get the impression that you feel that there is a deal to be had with the Palestinians. And Itamar, I've gotten the impression from you over the last few years that you don't believe the Palestinians are in a position, that is, Abbas and his government, to make a deal. So can you flesh that out?
No, well, there is a deal to be had. I'm not sure that it can be had now. You know, for a deal to take place, you need three main partners: the Palestinians, the Israelis, and the United States, the only broker, the only effective broker. Right now, you have an Israeli government, a right-wing Israeli government. You have, I doubt that Abbas can move. He missed with Olmert. Should have made more of it, and look at Condi Rice's memoirs and her comment on that. I think that March 2014, after the meeting with Obama, he promised to come back, and he never came back to Obama. It was not all Netanyahu's fault. And three, I think Obama right now is not in a very good position to broker an Israeli-Palestinian deal. So right now, I think the terms are not very promising. But I think there's a deal to be had, and I think that deal should be made from my perspective. But not right now, I'm afraid.
Ambassador Kurtzer, you agree?
I agree fully. The timing in all three political partners here doesn't work. As Itamar suggested, the Palestinians are now not just weak, but divided both politically and geographically, and that's not likely to change. Obama has a lot of other fish to fry right now, and including trying to secure whatever support he can for what may emerge as an Iran deal. And at least the way the coalition may be shaping up in Israel, you don't know till it actually is agreed. But if a coalition does shape up with 67 seats, essentially all on the right side of the political spectrum, there would not be a strong desire for action in the peace process. It's a reason why I've argued since our midterm elections, even before the announcement of Israeli elections, that rather than just take our cards and go home, we use these 2 years to refashion our own policy. If you ask American diplomats, what do we stand for, they'll tell you we stand for a two-state solution, but we don't have positions on many of the key issues to be negotiated. Now, the actual details of those positions should be left to the parties, but we should have a view on what it means to have a Palestinian state that's viable and contiguous and can operate on the international scene. We should have a view on Jerusalem, as challenging as that is, and on refugees and on security. And so I've argued that rather than try to bring about a negotiated settlement over these 2 years, which I don't think would happen at all, we should fix our own policy in a number of ways so that when hopefully all three of the parties are ready to get back to negotiations, you have a stronger American infrastructure, political infrastructure to take you forward.
I think I'm going to feed you a little bit of bitter medicine now. I forget what they call it, the stuff you don't like to swallow.
Castor oil.
Castor oil. Itamar, you've had some interactions over the years with the American Jewish community, with the Jewish organizations. I remember around the time of the Oslo Agreement, somebody in Queens was throwing vegetables at you in a synagogue. Has the Iran dispute over the last few months put the American Jewish community, either the kind of liberal majority or the organizations as mediators, in a difficult position, in a dangerous position? And then I'll ask you, Dan.
Yeah. Well, I think these are two different issues. Basically, since the announcement of and the signing of the Oslo Accord, I could not go into an Orthodox synagogue. The Kahana people decided that if I wanted to speak elsewhere, I could, but if I wanted to step on their ground as they saw it, they would try to prevent me from that. Congressman Nita Lowey asked me a month before that to come and speak to her constituency, and this happened to be a day before the signing. And part of her constituency at that time was in Queens, and the Kahana people were there. That became a famous incident. But larger than that, part of and this now connects us to the second part of the question. Israeli politicians or Israeli politics tended to export themselves to this country. And part of the way the opposition to the Rabin government acted against the peace process was try to mobilize American Jewish and American public opinion against the peace process. One favorable theme was American peacekeepers on the Golan, that the deal between Israel and Syria would involve American peacekeepers, that would put them in harm's way. Let's not have American peacekeepers on the Golan. And there was a whole campaign of right-wing emissaries who used to come from Israel, work with right-wing Jewish organizations and elements in the fundamentalist community, trying to galvanize American opinion against this. I would say for good measure, Israeli left also tends to export its politics to this country because many in the Israeli left believe in an imposed settlement as the only option out of the predicament, and they would like to mobilize American policy to impose a settlement. So it's done in that regard on both sides of the aisle. Now, clearly, the fact that Netanyahu pitted himself against the president in the fashion that has been described before and took on the president in Congress and elsewhere has, of course, made the life of Jews in general and Jewish organizations more miserable. My lesson from earlier efforts to take the American president on Capitol Hill was done with Carter on the AWACS and was done with Bush and Baker on the loan guarantees. Somebody said at the time, you don't want to take the President of the United States on Capitol Hill because you do not want to lose and you do not want to win. If you lose, your bluff is called, and if you win, you have a wounded animal in the White House. So I think it was a grave error the way the Boehner episode, as it was called earlier today, was followed, and of course made the position of the Jewish community in this country much more difficult.
Dan, I want to ask you the same question, but it seems to me that when you were Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, you were rumored to be having your own troubles with your shul in Camp Mill, I believe, Silver Spring. No?
No, the rumors were wrong.
Okay.
I was having trouble with other parts of the Jewish community, but not my own synagogue. Itamar was having vegetables thrown at him. I was having epithets thrown at me in Israel, including Yehudon Katan from the Knesset podium. So, you develop you're never quite immune to being hurt by those, but you keep going. Look, I think we're at a pregnant moment in relationship to all of these questions, because in the politics of diplomacy, I think the Republicans sense an opportunity to try to reconfigure American Jewish political support, American Jewish financial support, which may be in some respects even more important, and tying that together with the pro-Israel evangelical community in ways that they had only experienced once before, and that was the Reagan-Carter election, when Carter scored very low percentage of Jewish support. Obama, you remember, got 78% of the Jewish vote in his first election, got about 70% in his reelection. The Republicans, I think, smell blood and believe that they can do very much better by positioning themselves as the party that supports Israel when push comes to shove. And that has a lot of ramifications. Number one, it has ramifications within our own Jewish community. Look at what's happening in this community. You can have, when Itamar mentioned the effort on Capitol Hill on the part of the Zionist Organization of America to rally Congress against supporting an Israel-Syria peace treaty, and that's what ZOA was trying to do, and yet they are in the tent of the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, and look who's not in the tent, J Street. Or you can have a situation where right-wing organizations in this country can not only support right-wing causes in Israel, including funneling substantial amounts of money to Israel in through tax-exempt channels, but who has the effort been made against to stop them from participating in the Israel Day Parade, the New Israel Fund, which is supporting activities on the other side of the spectrum. So it's not just that the Republicans may be positioning themselves in a way to take advantage of this for electoral purposes and financial purposes, but our community is in a very challenged position right now, where the divide within ourselves is widening every day. I didn't have problems in my synagogue in Maryland, but if you were a member of the conservative synagogue in Princeton, where I now live, and it's the only real synagogue in town, they are having now for the past almost 3 years a huge fight over whether or not J Street should be allowed to rent a room once a year to hold a meeting. And major funders of that synagogue have threatened to walk out. So the rabbi came to me and asked if I could negotiate a truce, and I said, I don't think I'm the right person, having had such success with the Arabs and Israelis. So, they're trying to work this out on their own. But you look at these issues, you look at the Pew study, which even if it isn't entirely accurate or entirely reflective of our communities, suggests that there are deep embedded problems that the community is not facing, while the leadership is running around representing itself and not necessarily representing a much more diverse and pluralistic community than they want to admit exists.
Is the leadership taken seriously in what? Does it have any real sway? Does it have anything to lose?
Well, who gets invited to the White House barbecues, and who gets invited to the Prime Minister's office? It's not the representatives of JCCs or local communities. It's these largely self-appointed, executive directors of major organizations. And, I'm not saying anything personally against them, but in a community whose demographic is changing as rapidly as the American Jewish community's demographic is changing, the leadership in many respects no longer reflects the people who comprise this community. And what Pew told us, again, I'm not saying Pew is 100%, the Bible here, but it's a warning. What Pew told us is that there's a lot of people in our community, younger people, who are not necessarily turning anti-Israel, but they're simply turning off. They're just not paying attention anymore, and that's very worrisome.
Itamar, your sense of the I guess Jewish leadership is the word we use, but has their position changed in the last 20 years that you've been watching it? I don't mean their view, I mean their status.
Yeah.
relevance?
No, it's. I don't see a major change in that time frame. What I tried to do as ambassador was to reach out to the federations. I felt that if I really wanted to deal with the lively part of the community, real life, the two places, the synagogue movements and the federations, and these were groups that I started inviting for meetings at the embassy in order to create a direct dialogue between the embassy. I don't know that it has been continued since, but let's say I left here as ambassador in '96. It's almost 20 years. If I look at the map, it's about the same.
Should we throw it open? You want to take 3 questions for starters? Well, you had your hand up first, so.
So Israel and the Palestinian states aren't the only players in the Middle East who are seeing ISIS and what's been called radical Islam. The last Gaza war was called a proxy war by some. I'm not sure that was right, but it was called that. So I'm wondering how you see our conflict in this larger picture. How is that going to play out?
We're going to take 3 questions. That's been the tradition here. In the back?
If Obama and Iran conclude a deal, how much capacity do you think the Congress has to undermine that deal? And if they did conclude a deal, what do you think would be the Israeli reaction to that for Egypt?
Eric.
Yeah, on this issue of the changing politics of the American Jewish community, you know, ever since Irving Kristol wrote in commentary in 50 years ago, we've been told that Jews are turning Republican, and they never do, and the numbers are still pretty strong. But, number one, if you read Pew, Jews like us are disappearing, and Jews like those next door to where I teach in Brooklyn College are exploding, so there's that. But far more importantly, and I think this is what we miss, the issue is not so much Jewish votes as Jewish money. And the Republicans are doing great with Jewish money. And they don't really need votes so much. But it seems to me that that's what this is about. They don't have to win very much Jewish support, but as long as the billionaires are given sort of cover to become Republicans, that can have a fundamental transformation of the role of Jewish politics, given the way the Supreme Court is interpreted the role of money in American politics. So I don't think we're paying enough attention to that, rather than which way votes. Because the votes, I think Jews are pretty happy where they are, and Obama's numbers are still pretty good. They're not great, but they're pretty good.
And your question?
Well,
Don't you agree?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have the valence of the Israel-Palestine conflict. We have the a deal between Obama and Iran, and we have the money. We'll take more questions after you guys respond to these 3.
Okay. So to Barbara Tversky's question, it is a different Middle East. The Arab state system collapsed both as a system, and many of the states, there are at least 5 failed states in the Arab world. It's very difficult for the United States to find credible local allies, a pole for the policy. Egypt could be one. Turkey could be one. The relationship with Egypt is difficult now. Turkey is problematic. Actually, Israel's value as a potential ally has increased. And in order to be a valuable regional ally, Israel needs to be able to play more in regional politics, and the entry ticket is at least a functioning peace process with the Palestinians. So it's not fully used, but I think the whole outlook on where Israel fits in the region, the relative weight of the Palestinian issue, these have actually all changed. So the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has a different place in the context of the region. I, by the way, don't think that the Gaza war was a proxy war. It was directly. The Syrian civil war is a proxy war. The war in Yemen is a proxy war. The war in Iraq is a proxy war. But Israel Israel and Hamas. Israel and Hezbollah would be a proxy between Israel and Iran. But Israel and Hamas is straightforward, unfortunately, business. On the president and Congress, yes, Congress can spoil the deal, but here again, I think it's not directly related, but I think President Obama made a big mistake over the Syrian chemical issue when he went to Congress. He didn't have to. For a raid, an aerial raid, he didn't have. It's not a war. He didn't have to go to Congress. He gave a lot so gave up some executive privilege, and gave a lot to Congress. And I think to some extent, he's reaping the bitter harvest of that. But Congress, I hope not, because I think it would be very bad for the whole international system if it turns out that the President of the United States cannot run his foreign policy. Eric, it's always a pleasure to listen to you.
Question about the Israeli response to if the deal gets done.
There's not, I think there's not much that Israel can do. Israel, in 2012, 2013, used the military threat and didn't implement it, and it's gone. And I think Netanyahu went to Congress, used his ammunition. The president was able to overcome it. I think his ability to affect the policy is very limited now.
Let me work backwards. I agree fully with Itamar. It was interesting the other day after the congressional action that Yuval Steinitz, the Minister of Intelligence and Strategic Affairs, said the congressional action was a victory for Israel. And I think that's like backwards. I mean, it's okay if Israel wants to claim credit for it, but in fact, there's nothing in the bill that's going to the floor of the Senate that Israel wanted in it. There's nothing in it other than congressional review, which the Congress should review an agreement as important as this, and a requirement that the administration report every, whatever it is, 60 or 90 days on implementation. But there's nothing about recognizing Israel or Iran's aggressive behavior in the region. This was a huge political defeat for the prime minister when the Congress that he had lobbied so hard came up with a bill that the White House was immediately willing to say they're ready to sign. And I agree with Itamar. There's not much, if the deal actually does get concluded and does not lead to a crisis in Washington between the administration and the Hill, there's not much Israel can do at that point. I think the die would have been cast. With regard to what the Congress can do, that's a different question. This is not a treaty, and the United States is not the sole party negotiating it. You saw already that the Iranians are pushing back and saying, thank you very much that Congress has spoken, but this is now an agreement between Iran and 6 countries representing an international community. So there will be a period of significant diplomatic turmoil should the Congress seek to amend or, at worst, to sink the U.S. participation in whatever is agreed. It does call for, then, a much closer coordination between the administration and Congress than we've seen until now. And that would suggest that I think you'll see more trips to the Hill by Wendy Sherman, our undersecretary, even the secretary himself, to keep the Congress apprised of what's happening. On the first question, one would have hoped that the U.S.-Israeli relationship would be such today that it could take advantage of what Itamar said, which is exactly right, and that is that Israel does have a lot to offer in a region which is in such turmoil and flux. I was in Egypt 2 months ago, and the leadership there, this was before the president had decided to release the airplanes and the Apache helicopters that had been put on hold. And the leadership in Egypt was making the case for the United States to stop holding up these arms deliveries. And I heard in one conversation, at 5 different points in the conversation, you know, our relationship with Israel is better now than our relationship with the United States. So I said, you know, this is one of the great diplomatic successes of the United States. You know, our 2 treaty partners now like each other more than they like us. Now, to their credit, they laughed when I said that, but the fact is that there is a moment now in which the stability and the strength of Israel can actually work in very significant ways to advance not just Israeli interests, but also American interests, if we can talk to each other about these issues. And it gets us back to that first issue. I'm not sure we're doing a good job talking even about the areas in which we potentially can agree.
Well, sir, and, well, let's start with you.
So I want to come back to something Ambassador Kurtzer had mentioned of the way in which transnational politics has happened, in which American politicians are involved. I'm sorry, where Israelis are engaging in American politics, and vice versa. Because it seems that this is a story that has been seen and experienced before. Because it happened also not only on Netanyahu allying with Gingrich, but it was also President Clinton sending James Carville and Stanley Greenberg and I think Frum as well to Israel to work with Ehud Barak against Bibi Netanyahu. Is this something that is going to now become the norm, or is this something that is now just as a matter of what happens every time Bibi Netanyahu becomes prime minister?
I must, if I may, I must correct you on this one. The group that worked with Ehud Barak was not sent by Obama, and the habit of they are businessmen. They were paid very well by donors of Ehud Barak to come and do that. This President Clinton made no secret of his desire in '96 that Peres would defeat Netanyahu, and he came to shore up Peres in March 1996 without much effect. But I think the first American political advisor who was hired to help in Israeli elections was David Sawyer, who was brought in, I think, 1981 to help Shimon Peres in elections in Israel. And then, of course, Arthur Finkelstein famously came to help Netanyahu in '96. And so it's become very common, and I don't think it's ideological, it's financial, basically monetary, it's a business relationship. I would say this, actually, in the month preceding the recent Israeli elections, President Obama has been very careful not to be critical or not to take radical action against Netanyahu, because he was given advice that this might be counterproductive. So he may have been, to some extent, even overly cautious, being afraid of a counterproductive outcome.
Yeah, I agree. And I would separate out what Itamar is absolutely correct in saying, the private enterprise part of U.S.-Israeli electoral politics, because these guys are getting paid. Now, they may be paid for something that our president would like them to succeed in doing, but the fact is it's a business. What has always been part of the relationship is a certain amount of interference in each other's politics. That's part of life. Israel's not the only country that has a congressional relations staffer or staff in its embassy to try to influence Congress on issues of concern to Israel. We don't have that same infrastructure in Israel, but we talk to the policymakers and the legislators and let them know what our views are. What we don't do, though, is play the partisan politics in Israel the way that Netanyahu has been playing partisan politics here. At the time of the Boehner, Ron Dermer exchanges, I think I was quoted, and I know I gave it to a journalist, that had I even considered going behind Sharon's back to the Labor Party to advance some American interest in the Knesset, not only would Sharon have had me thrown out of the country, but the Bush administration would have had me thrown out of the country. It's just something that would not even have entered my imagination to do. But of course, I also did play politics. I would meet with the cabinet members and I would meet with legislators in the Knesset and urge them to support things that the United States wanted them to support. But you know, there's limits. You set parameters within which you operate that don't really exceed the accepted norms.
I think we have time for 3 more questions, and I see 3 hands. But if anybody, oh no, there's 5. So if anybody can come up with a question that gets them somehow to disagree with each other, that would be good. Yes?
I can't remember.
Is Princeton the best university in the world?
I hope so. My son's going to cost us a fortune next year.
Just very brief. First question, in the news, there was a story about Israel having a spy in the United States, and it was brought out in the newspapers. Secondly, another item was that American Jewry will have to, who are Democrats, are considering, their position in voting for a Democrat in the next election, or even siding with Obama. And the latter one was in the Wall Street Journal, which is a conservative paper, but these were 2 items that are very interesting, and I'm wondering your comment on possibly.
Professor Cohen.
Every conflict needs an image of how the conflict will end. The prevailing image, take a big beating, is the 2-state solution. Is there an alternative to the 2-state solution as an image of how this conflict will end?
Yes.
Yes, my question is specifically for Ambassador Rabinovich. Much of today we've been discussing the changing relationship of American Jews to Israel and the growing controversies and contentiousness within the American Jewish community vis-a-vis Israel. I'm wondering, based upon your knowledge of the Israeli leadership, to what extent are Israeli leaders, Israeli politicians, aware of the shifts going on within the American Jewish community vis-a-vis Israel, and how much do they care? Do they take the view that, well, even if American Jews may be becoming more critical, evangelical Christians are solidly behind us, or Sheldon Adelson is totally supportive of us? I mean, does it matter that American Jews, or at least a significant segment of the American Jewish community, is becoming more critical to the Israeli political leadership?
We'll come back, we'll have one last round, but the Israeli political leadership, is there an Israeli spy? And please tell us how we can fix the Middle East.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a spy. I cannot tell you his name. But, seriously, since the Pollard affair, there's every so often some news outlet here would run a story about a mole, a spy, and so forth. I think the effect of the Pollard affair on the Israeli system has been such that it would take a lot of hard thinking before any Israeli leader or bureaucrat would think about repeating that stupid exercise. On shift towards the Republicans, yes. We've heard the percentages of 78, 70. It used to be 82. In the 90s, the percentage of Jewish vote in presidential elections for the Democrats was 82. So it has been shifting. To Professor Cohen's question, yes, the other alternative is a one-state solution. Which nothing happens, then at some point, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, there'll be a reality of one state, which to me is abhorrent. I think a one state is not going to be a Jewish state. It's probably going to be an Arab state or an unpleasant state. So that's the the counter vision to the one you mentioned. And there was the Professor Waxman.
Our Israeli politicians.
Israeli.
Shifts.
Yeah. It's very much in the public discourse. The Israeli press, television, so far is full of it. I think some of the politicians, statesmen, tend to take it seriously. I mentioned some pronouncements going back almost a year ago of people in the government, Israeli diplomats who began to speak about other options. These are individuals who don't take it seriously, but I think on the whole, Israelis are very sensitive. But in previous elections or in previous efforts by individuals in Israel to become prime minister, the question of can he handle the American relationship? Does he get along with American Jews was a key question. And one of the reasons that Shamir lost to Rabin in '92 was the fact that he failed to manage the American relationship. This time, clearly, a prime minister who bungled the American relationship got elected. So that tells you something. Got reelected.
Since JJ wants us to differ, I'll differ a little bit with Itamar on the last question. Watching this from a distance, I normally defer to Itamar on issues relating to Israeli politics, but watching this from a distance, I don't see any evidence that this Israeli government is paying any attention to anything except Sheldon Adelson and a couple of other very wealthy American donors. This is a government, after all, that doesn't even pay attention when 150 of its own generals complain, or when former heads of the Shin Bet, 183 its generals, or former heads of the Shin Bet. So why would they pay attention to American Jews who, don't count for much? So I'm not sure they're paying much attention. On the Israeli spy question, the problem with your question is that as soon as you asked it, the NSA sent all of its beams down on this room, and we're now being listened to very carefully. I'll stick with Itamar's answer to that. Yeah. Will Jews vote Democrat? The reality is that I think you have to distinguish between who the Jewish community will vote for in the presidential election as opposed to the support that Jews have traditionally given to local Democratic candidates as well. And so far, there's not much to suggest that there's a change in the community at the sub-national level. And at the national level, it's going to, you saw, I think it was in today or yesterday's newspapers, the challenge that a Hillary Clinton will have should she become the candidate in how she positions herself. On the one hand, it's the Clinton name, where a president who had Israel in his kishkas. This is, his spouse, and she has her own record of support. The Republicans will trot out the hug that she gave to Suha Arafat. They will refer to her time as Secretary of State, in which she had some run-ins with the Prime Minister. So, if she becomes the candidate, it's going to be a very interesting challenge for her to position herself in a way to try to keep as much of that support as possible. And I think it's too early to tell whether that's going to work for her. On Steve's question on the alternative image, I'd address it in a couple of ways. One, everybody is looking for a plan B because plan A, the two-state solution, just looks like it's not going to work. And there is no plan B that works, as much as people would like to try it. So, whether it's a one-state solution, Avi Gil wrote an article just a couple of months ago, in which he said the dichotomy that we normally talk about between Jewish and democratic when it comes to the choice that Israel has to make is not the right way of framing the issue. It's Jewish versus non-Jewish. Because if you have a one-state solution, is it a Jewish state in values if you don't give Palestinians their rights? And will it be a Jewish state politically if you do give Palestinians their rights? And so at the end of the day, the real issue here is, do you want a Jewish state, which may be smaller than probably a lot of us would prefer, but still can maintain its values and have its own arguments and think about who it is and what it is and how it defines itself? Or do you have this other set of issues which ends up it being not a Jewish state for either reason? There's no image that's caught anybody's imagination yet except the right wing in Israel. I take my graduate students almost every fall to Israel, and we specifically will meet with, the Uri Ariels and settler leaders, and their attitude is quite interesting. You walk in and they say, "We'll talk to you, but why are you here? The conflict is over. We won." And then you say to them, "Well, what did you win? You're still an occupying authority. The rest of the world doesn't agree with you, including the United States. You haven't made a choice yet as to what to do with the people, and you're making this incremental choice about the territory, but you quite haven't made a decision there either with respect to sovereignty. So what do you mean you've won? What is really your plan here?" And the answer is they don't have a plan, because there is no alternative image that can work or that will capture people's imaginations.
Should we take 3 more questions and then get you back in time for Game of Thrones? You've been very patient. You've been very patient, and Daniel. So, sir.
Just a contrarian question. It's not something fundamental. Ambassador, you've mentioned that the least problem is the personal chemistry between Obama and Netanyahu, and then there are a bunch of strategic issues. But isn't it true that strategic issues or strategic positions are also staked by the people? And so it was largely Obama's choice. Some would argue the vacuum of American power that Obama projects toward the world that brought about all this, the Ukraine situation and whatever other Cuba situation that many are up in arms against. And maybe there isn't really 2 different sets of situations, but the whole thing is just rooted in Obama and in his policies and in his attempts to remake the world.
Going back to the first part of the session when you mentioned about trying to pick up where Omer and Abbas had finished in 2008. I recall that because we were sitting in this very room with the Taub session discussing it just 2 days or 3 days after it fell apart. And I'm curious if you know 2 or 3 things you could share with us that you would have liked to see them address, because I recall that just 2 days after Obama was inaugurated, he sent George Mitchell as special envoy, and I think there couldn't have possibly been a better person to choose to send. And so I'm just curious what 2 or 3 things you would have liked to see.
And Daniel?
Do you believe that Netanyahu is interested in Israel someday achieving the sort of deal that you think is to be had with the Palestinians? Or alternatively, are you concerned that Netanyahu will use the next however many years in office in order to take actions on the ground that will permanently foreclose the possibility of such an agreement?
Shall I go first?
I'll go first and be brief. To the second question, I think the simplest way to put it is that in early 2009, America went left and Israel went right. That you elected a left-wing Democrat and we elected the head of the Likud, and I don't think it would have worked out, because Netanyahu was not willing to accept what Olmert was willing to put on the table. So personally, I don't think it would have worked out. So register another disagreement. So that's the point that's the point I wanted to make.
Look, on the first question, I reject the premise entirely. Obama, there is no Obama doctrine that we can define. There are people who think they can. So I'm not sure that you can then say that Obama's policies have caused what happened in Ukraine, or you included Cuba in that, which is not quite understandable, since Cuba is potentially a breakthrough for American diplomacy, not a challenge to American diplomacy. But I just reject the premise entirely. Obama has a certain certain set of views about the world. He has made them relatively clear, and they include changing some aspects of what had become the militarization of our foreign policy under the George W. Bush administration. They have to do with reaching out to former enemies and seeing whether or not at least a reasonable change can be had in the relationship, if not a full 180-degree reversal. I mean, this is what Iran is all about. We are not going to be best friends with Iran the day after this agreement. We hopefully will see Iran's nuclear program set back for X number of years, but we still have a lot of work to do with a very aggressive and potentially hegemonic Iran still playing out its ambitions in the region. So no, I don't accept the premise. Secondly, with the point at which Itamar noted that we disagree, I have no doubt that had the Obama administration in 2009 tried to pick up where things had left off, it would not have succeeded immediately. There's no question about it, because of the reasons that Itamar suggested. The Israeli government that was elected in office didn't agree with what its predecessor had done. My argument, however, is that the fact that Israel may not have agreed to do that should not have been the determining factor in the United States abandoning what had been done. Because if you're going to be a third party, you're not simply going to follow every twist and turn of Israeli policy, nor would you follow every twist and turn of Palestinian policy. There's got to be something called American policy, which, because we're allies with Israel and friends with Israel, we will coordinate more closely than we will to Palestinians, but we can differ, and we can have views that don't reflect those of the prevailing government in the country. And so rather than start out in 2009 saying, we're going to get to negotiations on the basis of what Olmert and Abbas did, which would have been a failure, you start out by saying, this is what the Obama administration stands for, and you then work it. You work it with your diplomacy, you work it with your speeches. You have an early trip to Israel by Obama in which he can talk to the Israeli people directly. You have a number of things that happen in which you try to build support for something that the United States believes in. It may end up changing based on what you hear, but at least you have a basis on which to pursue your policy objectives. On the last question, is Netanyahu interested in? Itamar may know better than I, but as far as I can see, he is the first prime minister who does not have anyone with whom he consults, except perhaps Dermer, the ambassador. Sharon, with whom I worked for 4.5 years as ambassador, had his ranch group. On most weekends, there were a number of his friends and colleagues and advisors with whom he consulted over a meal down at the ranch. And nobody pretended that they were making policy or that Sharon was beholden to them. But there was a dynamic at play in which he was able to bounce ideas and hear ideas. There's nothing to indicate that Netanyahu has any of that, except perhaps with Sarah. And I know that's going to get a laugh, but it's not, people do consult with their spouses, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But if that's the only person with whom he's consulting, then nobody knows the answer to your question. And that's what the Israeli people should be demanding.
I actually failed to respond to that part, to your third question. I would say I'm not sure that Netanyahu is not a leader with a vision. He's very much a status quo, very conservative in trying to stay with status quo, which, of course, when you look at trying to achieve diplomatic solutions to problems is a problem. but when it comes to getting involved in wars, he's actually an advantage. He's been very careful in the Syrian context and in other contexts because he is that conservative status quo person. So I'm not sure that if you were to ask him, how do you envision Israel 10 or 15 years from now, there would be a well-rehearsed response.
I think we end it here. I'd like to jump in and take the privilege of having a microphone in front of me to share one story which may cast a little light on the two-state solution, one-state solution. And I heard this from Yossi Beilin 12 years ago, I guess it was. He was in Geneva negotiating with some PLO people for what's called the Geneva Initiative. It was kind of a pretend peace treaty that was meant to lay out what an end solution could look like. He said that he was having lunch one day with Kadora Faris, who is now a member of the Fatah Central Committee, I believe, at the time was best known as a senior aide to Marwan Barghouti. And Beilin says he asked him, "Why are you here?" And Faris said, "What does that mean?" And he said, "If you sat on your hands for 10, 20 years, you'd be the majority and then you'd have it all. Why settle now for 22%? And Faris said, if we sat on our hands for 10 or 20 years, we'd be the majority. And after another 80 years of struggle and blood, perhaps we could claim control. But I have children, and I don't want them growing up like that. So I'll take what I can get now if I can give my children a life." So with that, Professor Zweig.
I'd like to thank our panel and our moderator. It's been a long day. We've had a chance to examine American Jewry and Israel and their changing relationship from the inside and from the outside. I'd like to thank all the participants and the audience. The next Taub Center event will be a lecture by Dr. Hillel Nosek on the 4th of May on the subject of censorship in the Israeli media. If you're on our mailing list, you will receive notification 5:30 in the afternoon, 4th of May, at the Taub Center offices on the Washington Mews. Thank you all.